My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have a really special episode for you today because it is the final episode of Snake Talk. So going back about 6 years, I decided to start this podcast, mainly because I just felt like there was a real lack of knowledge out there on snakes. And I wanted to get some of that information out to the world, through some of these new media channels. And I've always been really into podcasts. And so I thought, my connections in the snake world and my interest in podcasts could come together really well and provide all of you out there with a lot of information on snakes. So looking back on it, kind of made the decision that, like I said, it's been about 6 years. We're over 150 episodes in, and I feel like we have created a really a significant and important body of work where we've interviewed all kinds of people. We've really captured a big amount of snake information and knowledge. And I just really felt like it was time, for Snake Talk to come to an end. And the last thing I would tell you guys about that is that I would just stay tuned because my podcasting days are not over. And we have some interesting things in the works. So while Snake Talk is ending, there are new things on the horizon. So just, again, pay attention. So for this final episode of Snake Talk, we are going to turn the microphone around. And basically, the person who produces this podcast is going to interview me. So with that, I would introduce Tracy Karplus. She produces the podcast and has since the very beginning. So welcome to the podcast, Tracy. How does it feel to be on Snake Talk?
Thank you. It feels strange, but it's pretty good. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Okay, well, hey, I'm the guest today, so I am just going to turn it over to you. And I'll let you take it whatever direction you want to go.
All right, that sounds great. So I guess, like in typical Snake Talk fashion, let's start at the very beginning. So tell us, where did you grow up? And what kind of kid were you? Like, how did you get into snakes?
Yeah, that's kind of a interesting story. And it's, I've hinted at this, in interviewing other people, but it's maybe not the typical story for a lot of, herpetologists at least. But so first of all, I grew up in rural New England, in a pretty kind of rural, wild type of landscape. And I spent a lot of time outside, and, I was always, first of all, I grew up camping and hunting and fishing and catching frogs and ponds and just that kind of lifestyle, which was really amazing. But as a child, I actually had quite a fear of snakes. And, I don't know if it was, paralyzing, but it was a pretty distinct irrational fear, like the same type of fear somebody might have for spiders or sharks or something like that. I had that for
Right.
snakes.
Do you know where it came from? Like, do you remember your first encounter with a snake?
I don't know if it was my first encounter, but I remember two encounters from when I was a really young child. I don't know exactly how old, but one was a garter snake.
Hmm.
And I remember I was, out, the back door of my house, kind of on the stoop there. And there was a garter snake right next to this concrete stoop. And it kind of had its head almost periscoped. And, and it, I was terrified. And again, as we go along, and it's one of kind of the themes of this podcast, we even talk about it, I believe, in the intro, but like, you know, that fear was actually a really deep fascination. And
Hmm.
that's kind of how, it kind of came up with the intro for this. But I also had another event from when I was really young. We were swimming in like a local river or creek, and we're at a pretty big hole, like an old dam had been blown out at an old mill site. We were swimming in the pond that remained there, and would have been a water snake swam across the water, and again, just absolutely petrified. So it really
Oh, no.
started. It started with fear.
Do you think it came from any of the adults in your life or from TV or?
At that point, I think it was more kind of that genetic component of fear. We had
Hmm.
an episode on that, how there kind of are these innate as well as these learned aspects of snake fear, and I just really
Yeah.
hadn't had much experience either through media. you know uh my upbringing, I was raised by my father, and my mother really wasn't part of my life, and even my father at that point in my life really wasn't a big component of my life. I mean, he kept me alive, which was great, but you know, uh, there were just, I was alone a lot. So like both of those experiences I talked about with the snakes and the fear, those were events when I was either alone or with a buddy, and so
Hmm.
it really wasn't learned. I wasn't taught that by my parents because I just didn't have a normal childhood. I didn't have parents that were real present to even teach me good or bad around snakes.
Hmm. How did you realize that this was more of a fascination? Like, when did that come about? Did this come about later when you started an interest in biology or?
Yeah, I mean, so I went to some degree. I went away from like the whole like outside thing, meaning like even the hunting and the fishing and the looking for frogs and all of that. I kind of went away from that as I got into, say, high school and maybe early college. But in college, I ended up as a gen ed taking a wildlife ecology class, and it just like brought all of that from my childhood, nature and wildlife, just brought it roaring back. And I knew that's what I needed to do in my life. So I switched my major, from history to wildlife biology, and moved in that direction. And it just so happens like my first, well, I wanted to kind of be like uh, especially bears. I've always and continue to be very interested in bears, especially black bears. And so, I kind of thought I was going to be a bear biologist, maybe some other type of large mammalian carnivore. But my first internship that I had while I was an undergrad, it was a summer internship. It was kind of a program where there were hundreds of options, and you put your name in the hat, and you kind of ranked priorities of interest, and they end up sending you somewhere. And it just so happens I ended up getting sent out west to California, to the Sierra Nevadas, and I was doing a whole, just a whole variety of reptile and amphibian related surveys. And
Wow.
so that got me into reptiles and amphibians, because when I came home from that experience, like I was even more focused that within wildlife ecology, I was like interested in reptiles and amphibians. And of course, that brought me into this realm where snakes reside, and had all these fears. And as I was gaining this interest and knowledge in all these animals, and I was just like devouring like field guides, reading about whatever newt ecology. And but I realized pretty quickly during that process that this intense fear that I had for snakes was actually a really, really deep fascination, and that kind of set the ball rolling with snakes.
Wow. So, what were some of these early surveys you talk about? Starting to delve into amphibians. What were some of the early
Yeah, so
species that
out in
you've studied?
California, I
Mm.
was, yeah, in that first experience in California, it was primarily two species, both of which are kind of considered, conservation concerns. But one was Western pond turtles,
Mhm.
and the other were mountain yellow-legged frogs. So the pond turtles were typically kind of lower elevations in the Sierra Nevada, whereas the mountain yellow-legged frogs were kind of like a high elevation meadow species. And as I mentioned, both of them were just really kind of, um, serious conservation concern. But I also, talking about snakes,
Mhm.
I had the opportunity to see my first rattlesnake in the wild when I was on that trip. Because, where I grew
Oh.
up and where I lived, rattlesnakes were incredibly rare. And so, to see a rattlesnake in New England, you almost have to kind of be looking for it, because you have to go to very specific places. But out in California, I was, we were out surveying frogs, and um, it was actually kind of a strange situation to see your first rattlesnake, because it was very high elevation. It was in a high elevation meadow, and it was relatively cold. It actually started kind of snowing later that day. I mean, it didn't accumulate or anything, but and I was walking along a creek bank, and I heard a snake rattling, and it just kind of and it was right next to the creek, kind of in a small shrub at the base of it. And just, yeah. So during that first job working with reptiles and amphibians, I did have the opportunity to see my first rattlesnake as well.
That's amazing. Um, was this okay? So, what was your first reaction at this point? Were you had you handled snakes at all, or was this a fearful event for you?
Now, I guess I would say so. I didn't handle that rattlesnake, and I hadn't really been handling snakes. I probably had handled a couple up to that point,
Mhm.
but I definitely wasn't terrified. Like it was a real fascination type moment. I remember watching that animal for quite a while and just being really, really just kind of interested and fascinated in it, and just, really thought it was beautiful, and on and on. So, my response wasn't wasn't fear. It was definitely that fascination side of things.
Okay. And at what point did you feel like this could have been your career? I mean, were you moving in that path when you were out doing this field work at this point, or were you just interested in biology and
Yeah, I guess,
exploring?
so at that point I would have been an undergraduate, and I came back and I started doing some small independent projects. But at that time, I really dove in all reptile and amphibian.
Hmm.
And the problem was that, I spent a little too much time during the first half of my undergrad, partying and not studying. So I didn't have the best grades in the world. And so I ended up, I knew I needed to go to graduate school. And pretty early on knew that I was interested in working in the field with reptiles and amphibians. And, I pretty early on kind of was working towards likely being like a faculty member at a university. And so
Hmm.
I went from my undergrad to do my master's, but again, I didn't have really good grades. And so, but one thing I always had, and I always tell people that I'm mentoring this, is I always could communicate relatively well, either like giving like big lectures or talking to people one-on-one or small groups. I just could always kind of relate to people, and whether it was a big group of scientists or a group of Cub Scouts or I always do that. And so I used that skill that I had. And even with my poor grades, I ended up getting into a lab to do a master's in the same department where I was doing my undergraduate, because I wasn't going to be able to go out and be competitive going to other places. And so I got into that lab, and then something really interesting happened. First thing I'd say is my project in that lab, well, it was going to be on reptiles. It was actually going to be on amphibians. It was not exactly what I wanted to do, but because again, my grades were not that strong, I had to really compromise to work towards my ultimate goal. And so anyways, I was just starting in this new lab, and I had this really, I'm not very I'm a pretty practical, like science objective type of guy. I've only had a couple experiences in my life that were really strange, and this was one of them. And so I'm in this program starting my master's. I'm working on essentially like deformities in amphibians, and in particular like how toxins in the environment could cause that. That was kind of where I was starting to go.
Okay. And remind me, which lab was this?
This is at the University of Massachusetts, still in the wildlife department. Again, I kind of had to stay in the same department because of my grades. And so I had a dream. And essentially it was like a research dream, like that I was like studying this species of salamander, marbled salamanders, which down here where I live now in the Southeast are very common, but up in the Northeast, they were one of the rarest reptiles and amphibians. So I had this kind of random dream about this species, and it was almost like a design. Like I dreamed about designing this study for these animals. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I wrote it all down. I still have it till today. I mean, I have it in a notebook at my house.
Wow.
So I wrote this all down. And then I was up in the lab, and I was building a big table to do some of these like experiments where I was going to look at like deformed frogs. And there was a new professor, Kevin McGarrigle, who was coming into the department. He was a landscape ecologist, really interested in like spatial ecology. And he was doing like a tour, and he came into the lab and he was talking to me. And this is within a week. I can't remember how many days, but it was within a week of this dream. And he starts talking to me about this project that he's starting on marbled salamanders. And he's got kind of like a proposal, like plan together for multiple graduate students. And he gives me a copy of it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't want to say it was exactly the same as my dream, but like my dream was very similar, like spatial ecology, how these animals are moving. And anyways, make a long story short, he invited me to like leave that lab I was in and come to his lab and be his first graduate student and work on this marbled salamander project. So for my master's, I actually had a dream about working on marbled salamanders in a very similar fashion to what I actually ended up doing. It was again, incredible. And I am not like some superstitious, I'm not like reading crystals at night and all that. Like, I mean, this is, but it happened.
Wow.
Anyways.
So University of
I don't even know if I answered your
Massachusetts.
question.
No, no. You had this dream that sort of steered you in this direction because soon after this professor invited you to study marbled salamanders. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
So where did that take you?
So that was a really great project. We had multiple graduate students and we all worked together, and I learned quite a bit. And, in particular, I credit, before that, I was a really hard charging field biologist, and I might probably was a little bit hard to deal with at times for some people, but I really credit Kevin for like making me more of a professional individual. And so I learned a lot there.
What about marbled salamanders were you studying?
Well, I was basically studying very similar things to my dream. I was studying, well, so first of all, the overall project was studying marbled salamanders in like a complex of vernal pools and kind of looking at what we call like metapopulation dynamics. It's one of the better metapopulation studies with a vertebrate animal. And so basically there were 14 ponds, and we were studying an incredible number of aspects, from their population biology to their movements to um, all kinds of things, genetics, and on and on. So my component of that, again, there are multiple graduate students over the years all working on all kinds of things, and my component was really setting up the project and getting it off the ground. There was a lot of infrastructure, and I put a lot of that in the ground, but then really looking at salamander movements. So that was, and again, that was kind of in line with that dream I had. So.
Yeah. Huh. All right. And this professor turned out to be an amazing mentor to you, it sounds like.
Yeah, Kevin's great. He's retired now, but we still keep in touch.
Where in your schooling career were you? Was this towards the end? Was this did this give you connections to some of your first jobs outside?
Well, so this was my master's, and I knew during my master's that I was going to go on for a PhD, and I was pretty focused on kind of that academic track at that point. And but by the time I finished with that, my master's in that lab, I was no longer the guy that I didn't have to settle as much. I didn't have to stay in one place and just use my connections. I had a lot of chops. I had multiple publications, and I was giving presentations at conferences every year, and again, just involved in this really big, significant project. So anyways, I started a pretty exhaustive search to look to do PhD projects, and this was the shift where I started working on snakes, and
Okay.
I wanted to basically do my PhD research on snakes. And I won't go through the whole process, but I really looked at universities and professors across the U.S. and beyond, and but I ended up landing at Idaho State University out in Idaho, pretty close to Yellowstone National Park.
Okay.
And I went there really for the lab. The university and the department was not exactly in line with my interests, but I went to work with one particular individual in his lab, and to work on Great Basin rattlesnakes. And that's Chuck Peterson. He's actually, was on our podcast, early on.
That's right.
So.
Okay, so tell me, I don't know how to word this. You mentioned like this lab wasn't in line with, I don't know, like explain.
Well, basically, I was a I was a real applied scientist,
Okay.
meaning that I was interested in like wildlife and wildlife biology, but in how it related to things on the ground, and and conservation and management. And typically those types of departments reside at what we call our land grant schools. So where I'd done my bachelor's and my master's at University of Massachusetts, that was the land grant school in Massachusetts. And then, but when I went to Idaho State, University of Idaho is actually the land grant in Idaho. And Idaho State was much more of like a classic biology department, a lot of like just molecular work and biochemistry and on and on. And so those areas were not really my focus. Again, I went to work with one particular lab, and that lab had a very kind of strong applied focus, but it wasn't in a department that I typically would have gone to if the lab wasn't there.
Okay. So what attracted you about that lab?
It was really the Chuck Peterson. And, he's one of the big names in snake ecology. And, you go back to some of the early books in that field. And, he's one of the handful of people that helped kind of pioneer, our understanding of snake ecology. And so it was to work with him specifically, but he also had a long-term project going on Great Basin rattlesnakes. And when I arrived, they'd been working and collecting data for over 10 years. And so coming into the lab and continuing that and being able to build my dissertation research off of that long-term study was just a great opportunity.
Okay. And so Great Basin rattlesnakes, is this where your love of venomous snakes begins?
Yeah, I guess I would say it kind of started earlier with that snake in the mountain meadow in the Sierra Nevadas. But this is the first time that I really had the opportunity to work with venomous snakes. And that was where I wanted to go. That was my plan at that point. I was going to be, again, a university professor at like an R1 school, a Research 1 school. So people could think like big schools like University of Georgia, University of Massachusetts, University of Montana. Like that's where I expected to be. And within that, I expected to primarily study rattlesnakes and their ecology and conservation biology.
Okay. And at this point, your vision for the future was academia. Were you just planning to teach and possibly have your own lab?
Exactly. Yep. That was the goal.
All right. So this was grad school. What first jobs did you have after this? If your vision was academia.
I've always had something starting before the last thing ends. So technically I started my PhD, 6 months before I defended my master's, and I started my first job before I finished my PhD. And so at the time, so to get one of those R1 type faculty positions, most people they do what's called a postdoc, and they do that sometimes for many years. And so I kind of had two postdoc opportunities. One was to go down to the desert Southwest and work in the Sky Islands on some of the rare rattlesnake species that live there. We've highlighted a number of those species in episodes over the years. But then my other opportunity was more local, and it was to work with a nonprofit called Wildlife Conservation Society, which is best known for their headquarters being the Bronx Zoo. And so I ended up, for a number of reasons, going with that one, even though rattlesnakes were a component of it, but it was actually a postdoc where I would be studying and doing like management plans for a whole suite of species, even beyond reptiles and amphibians. I was working on sage grouse and pygmy rabbits and a whole variety of things. I was, again, able to continue my rattlesnake work, but I could, I stayed in the same place I was currently living. It gave me a great opportunity, just have more connection to my dissertation and finishing that because I was still writing my dissertation. Okay. So anyways, I started a postdoc with Wildlife Conservation Society, and that would have been my first job was running a big program there.
All right. So was this a lot of field work? Um, Tell me more about the program. You mentioned sage grouse and
Yeah, it was kind of year-round field
Mhm.
work. So it was on a particular property, a Department of Energy facility. So a large piece of land. It was almost the size of the state of Rhode Island. And then within that, there were only like, I don't know, five or six small facilities. You could think of them maybe the size of like very small towns, like little villages. And so you had this huge area that had almost nothing in it. It was just completely wild. And it was kept that way, obviously, as a buffer for various nuclear related research projects and so on. So, anyways, out on this property, I was, running field work year round for a variety of things. In the winter, we were studying pygmy rabbits. In spring, we would roll into, studying sage grouse and snakes and lizards and, we'd be doing breeding bird surveys and other types of mammal trapping. So, yeah, it was a lot of field work, everything from riding snowmobiles around to you know surveying rabbits to flying in airplanes, doing elk surveys to
wow.
studying the ecology of rattlesnakes. So it was a lot of field work. I had field crews. I was out a lot myself, but I had multiple field crews that were out working, doing a whole variety of things as well.
Okay. And so how did this transition to starting a nonprofit?
So I had this job, and it was postdoc slash job. But the idea was I'd finish the postdoc and again go on to academia. But I ended up, even when I was with WCS, deciding to stay in the nonprofit world. After a year, they ended up giving me a more permanent job. And I was at that point kind of developing a bigger, broader program in that what we call the sagebrush steppe region, where I was essentially developing a program to look at conservation in that region for WCS. And so I was working in the nonprofit world. I was doing a lot of research, and then something happened along the way where I uh, I I'd started talking. So let me back up. So at WCS at the time, most of the programs were kind of like real place based. Like I said, the sagebrush steppe. There was one in the Adirondacks, and there won't be one in like whatever Tierra del Fuego, and
Hmm.
very place based programs. But there were also certain species based programs, and it might be whatever, wading birds or something of that nature. And one of those programs was on crocodilians, alligators and crocodiles. And I had been talking to the high ups at WCS about developing an analogous program for analogous to the crocodilian program for
Okay.
snakes. And we were starting to develop that, and the concept would be basically, I, instead of working in like one place and running a program, I would be working on snakes across a whole variety of places,
Ah,
in Africa and South America, North America, and on and on. And so I was working on that, and we had, a couple donors, and then I ended up meeting the donor, who I ended up creating the Orianne Society with. So, but to answer your question, I, after the first year of my postdoc, I had just decided to stay in the nonprofit world.
okay.
I don't know if at that point I had completely given up on, the that goal of being an academic,
Okay.
faculty member, but I did make the decision to stay in the nonprofit world.
Oh, all right. And then, as you were saying, you got the opportunity to start your own. How did that begin?
Yeah. So again, I was working at WCS, and I was working on creating this global snake program. And one of the donors that we were working with was a gentleman named Dr. Tom Kaplan. And he was a very significant donor to WCS overall. He was, in particular, very engaged in their big cats program, doing things like tiger conservation. But his daughter, who's named Orianne, she had the opportunity to interact with an indigo snake. And she asked her father if he would do for indigo snakes what he's doing for tigers. And so, um, given that Tom was already working with WCS and a lot of the big cat biologists, he started asking around in WCS about, whether there were any snake biologists. And so that's how we started working with him. And we were starting to work on, again, even while I was at WCS in this global snake program, one of the projects was working on eastern indigo snake conservation in southeastern North America. And then for whatever reason, I don't want to get into the details, but Tom decided that he didn't want to partner with WCS on this project or even the big cat work anymore. And so he kind of gave me an ultimatum. He said he was going to create a new organization focused on reptile conservation with eastern indigo snakes as the flagship. And, he wanted me to leave WCS and create it with him. And so that's when I decided, I had a big decision to make, but I left WCS and created the Orianne Society. And that was in 2008, so 18 years ago.
18 years ago. Wow. I've always loved that history of the Orianne Society. But tell us about what were the early days like? I mean, you were building something, big.
Yeah. So the early days it was a really interesting time because we were really a family nonprofit, meaning that like all of our funding, or the majority of our funding by far, was coming from one family. We had an incredible number of resources. And so we were developing programs, and we were getting infrastructure, meaning buying land and building facilities. And it was just a really exciting, kind of fast-paced, dynamic time. It was nonstop, just building, and whether that be actually building new facilities or building partnerships and programs. And just a really exciting time. Tom made a really significant initial investment to get the Orianne Society built up strong in a very quick way. So.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. What was the landscape like back then as far as other nonprofits working towards reptile and amphibian conservation? What was your vision for the Orianne Society at that point?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not much different than today, meaning there really weren't a lot of nonprofits, and there definitely weren't a lot of nonprofits that had any significant level of resources. And so today, I would still say there are more nonprofits, but they're really kind of the same number that have any significant amount of resources to really have an impact on the ground. And so we do have a lot more these days, but back then, there really weren't many. If you compare it to something like birds, there were nowhere near the number of nonprofits. There were nowhere near the size. They had nowhere near the number of members. But again, that pattern really kind of still continues today.
Right. So at that point, you were focused on indigo snakes.
Yeah, we were primarily focused on indigo snakes. Had some side projects. I've always, as I talked about earlier, I'm a real rattlesnake guy. So, I had some projects going on rattlesnakes, but in general, yeah, the organization was 95% focused on eastern indigo snakes, longleaf pine conservation, gopher tortoise conservation. That was the real focus.
All right. How did the Orianne Society branch out from there? I mean, today we have many different focuses.
Well, we made a transition. As I mentioned, we were a family nonprofit, which we were what the IRS would call a private operating foundation, which basically means we're kind of like a family foundation in that we get all of our money or the majority of our money from a family. But being a private operating foundation is different from being a family foundation in that the foundation gives their money to other people to do things, but a private operating foundation does most of the work. So basically, we were set up where we were getting most of our funding from the Kaplan family, but we were doing the work on the ground ourselves instead of just giving grants to other people. However, a handful of years into the Orianne Society, we decided to turn it into a public charity, and a public charity is essentially moving from, I should say, a private operating foundation and legally transferring to become a public charity. And a public charity is defined as a nonprofit it's funded much more broadly by the public, as the name would suggest. And there's all kinds of calculations that show you how you qualify and all of
Okay.
that. But you could think of it like any other nonprofit, like the Red Cross or Nature Conservancy or whoever, just a nonprofit that survives based on donations from the public more broadly. So when we did that, we decided to expand our scope. We wanted to keep our indigo snake conservation work strong, but we also realized developing an entire nonprofit and raising a multi-million-dollar a year budget focused on the conservation of one snake, it was going to be pretty difficult. And so we expanded our focus, but we kept kind of the same model. And so the Orianne Society, unlike a lot of other nonprofits, we like focus on a small number of things and really invest heavily and kind of do a comprehensive approach. So whereas a lot of nonprofits, even some of those in our space, they will end up working on a lot of things all over the place, a lot of species, a lot of places, a lot of issues. So the way you could kind of define the Orianne Society relative to some of the other nonprofits is that, we end up doing a lot on a small number of targets. Whereas a lot of other nonprofits do a little on a lot of targets. And so anyways, we maintained that model. And as we've developed additional programs, we've kind of selected targets and tried to develop these really, invested heavily into these comprehensive programs to conserve a smaller number of things.
Right. As we know, the species that we work on are often feared and often forgotten. As far as building a nonprofit that focuses on these, did you ever think it might not work?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, that transition from the Kaplan family to a more broader public support was hugely difficult. And it remains difficult today. I mean, there's a reason that there's not a lot of nonprofits and very few well-funded nonprofits in the reptile amphibian space. There's just less interest in it. And so there's been huge challenges. Our organization, also we have a membership program and kind of a small donors program, but our organization, the way we're structured, being really focused in a small number of places and species doesn't lend really well to having like a big membership based organization. So, we really rely on a small number of really engaged and focused donors and foundations. So, there's been huge challenges, and there's been multiple points throughout history where I wasn't quite sure if we were going to make it. And, every year there's some uncertainty, but I've really almost become numb to it. And, here I am 18 years later. And, it's been a struggle, but I don't concern myself with it. We're going to work hard at raising the money we need to do our conservation work. And I'm just kind of going to keep moving forward.
Yeah. What would you say has kept you going?
I guess, because I could have left multiple times over the years and taken other jobs. I could have tried to scale up and run a larger nonprofit. But at the there's a lot of reasons, but the core reason is that this is I created this. I founded this organization. I built it from the ground up. It's the only chance in my life that I am ever going to have to do something like that. And so it's just been a very difficult thing to want to leave. I have an incredible amount of freedom. I'm not really a city person, as you know. I traveled cities, but I'm able to live a lifestyle I want, running this
Mm.
organization, and it's just. But again, there's a lot of us kind of tangential reasons like that. But I mean, the core is just that this is something I created, something that I founded and have developed over the years, had the vision for, and yeah, it's my one chance in life to do that. So it's not something I'm planning on leaving.
And I think you built something pretty great. What did you learn about building the team and partnerships that helped shape this organization to what it is today? What advice would you give someone?
Yeah, well,
That's a really big question. Yeah.
there's multiple things. One, and I won't necessarily put these in order, but you mentioned team. One of the most important things is to have a good group of people. And don't get me wrong, I have fired so many people over the years. However, for a very long time now, our staff has been very stable, except for addition of new members. And we just have a really good group of people who work really hard, who are dedicated to the mission. So that's key. If it's if you can't put that together, and again, it took us a long time to get there, but that's really important. But the other thing I'd say is for other people who maybe want to be like an executive in a nonprofit, like the problem I see with a lot of people is that they're scientists, and I was a scientist, I am a
Mm.
scientist, but like people, they want to run something, but they really don't. They want to be a scientist. And so one thing that I've done is, I have to be just as interested in working with my accountants, my communications people, my HR people, my scientists, my conservation staff. It's all equally important. And if you're going to try to run an organization, you have to run all of it, or you're not going to do any of it effectively. The organization is going to crash. So that's really important. You have to have an interest in running a
Mm.
business. And because that's what I do. I mean, I have science information. I get to interact with my scientists. I get to spend time in the field, but I run a business, and you have to want that. If you're just a scientist and you have zero interest in business, you're not going to do well here. So that's a really important distinction. The other thing I would say is that communication. I mentioned it earlier. Having communication skills at kind of all levels is really important. It's really important in almost any career you have. But if you're going to be in a career that largely is going to depend on you talking to so many people, it's just a really important skill. So I could probably go on, but those are maybe some of the kind of core tenets of advice that I would give. Certainly that second one is really important. You gotta want to run a business if you're going to do this. You can't just want to be a scientist. If you want to be a scientist, go be a scientist. Don't let somebody else run the
Yeah,
business and you
that
work for
makes a
them.
lot of sense. So, what are you most proud of when you look at how far the Orianne Society has come?
Yeah, I guess it's really kind of the entire thing. It's over time, my interest and has left that, like, this particular project and this research on this animal. I'm still interested in those, but for me, it's part of running that business. So it's the cumulative, it's the whole. So what I'm most proud of is all of the pieces and how they fit together. Yeah, I'm most proud of the big picture, and that's on the career side of my life. That's what I see as my legacy. My legacy will be the Orianne Society, not any particular set of scientific papers or particular piece of land or group of people that we've influenced. Even though all of those are there and I'm proud of
Mhm.
it all, what I'm really proud about and what my legacy will really be is the entire thing, and growing the entire thing and all the different components in tandem, and building that product being the organization itself. That's what I'm most proud of.
Wow. What do you see coming for the Orianne Society in the next, say, 10 years?
Well, I see the Orianne Society. First of all, we really focus on tangible conservation results, and and again, not throwing shade on anybody, but a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of fluff in there. Like, what we do is on the ground. We can take you on the ground and show you the acres that we burned, the number of wetlands that we've restored, the number of places that we surveyed for snakes, whatever it might be. These are very tangible results. And I view the Orianne Society continuing in that form, and also being like biodiversity focused. And again, I'm not throwing shade here, but a lot of nonprofits in my lifetime have changed their focus. They've shifted more to like focus on issues such as climate change or like ecosystem services, meaning like healthy water for people, on those types of things. And those things are all really important, don't get me wrong. But like Orianne Society has, and I, think will continue to in the future be focused on biodiversity, in a landscape where many other groups have moved away from that. And the reasons for that may vary, but certainly some of it's for the money. And but I view the Orianne Society staying focused on its mission to conserve biodiversity, staying with that core approach, that like working on a small number of targets, but going really, really deep and having a very kind of comprehensive impact on that species or landscape. I kind of envision that. I envision that growing slowly over time. You could really say we probably have 4 of those, species landscape combinations that we're currently working on. Many of them are still growing. And, I could see that the number of those growing over time. But, I really picture kind of more of the same, and we do a lot of land conservation, more of that, for example. But yeah, I picture the Orianne Society continuing to be kind of almost like a boutique or like niche
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit. I envision continued growth, but slower growth rate than maybe some other nonprofits. But continued focus on biodiversity, continued tangible impact and results. So when people invest in conservation through the Orianne Society, they can see and they know that they're having an impact, and they can see it in the numbers, not just in the kind of fuzzy, fluffy side stuff.
All right. And my last question about the Orianne Society is, what do you hope people feel when they engage with our work? Like, what do you want people to associate the Orianne Society with? How do you want them to think of us?
Yeah, one thing I would say, first of all, is how we engage, and this as well as anybody, because you run our, in addition to producing this podcast, you run our communications for the organization. And I've always had this focus on like professional, just really clean, nice, inspiring communication work, meaning like use of great photography and videography and graphic design. That's always been a big focus of mine. That's because I'm inspired by so many things in the world, that that do that. And so, we've tried to stay with the times, and as you know, we do more like reels and quick things here and there, but we've also kept this focus on like documentaries and again, just beautiful photographic imagery, which takes time. It's not something you can always just do real quickly in an Instagram reel. And so that's how we communicate with people. We try to inspire them with really amazing communication material. And but I guess when people look at us, hopefully they're seeing that information, but hopefully they're also really getting what I was just talking about, the concept of like that the Orianne Society is making a difference. And yeah, we're not working on every species of reptile, amphibian, across North America or beyond, but like we've strategically selected species and places to work. And in those places, we are heavily committed, heavily engaged, and have a significant impact.
We sure are. All right. So winding this down, after all these years, what is your favorite snake?
My favorite snake?
To focus in more on you. Yeah, after all this work, conservation, studying out west, do you have a favorite snake?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I'm really fascinated by especially all venomous snakes, in particular vipers. But if I had to say, it's really two, and they kind of represent different things in my life. One would be the timber rattlesnake, and that represents the home side of me. I love the concept of home. I love having a house and a property and the real just kind of like home type of feel. So timber rattlesnake is my home snake and definitely one of my favorites. But the other big component of my life is adventure. And again, you see this through all aspects, whether I'm fishing, looking for snakes, hunting, just traveling, food, all of this. I also have a big adventure component. And so on the adventure side of things, I would have to say that the suite of Bushmaster species would also be there. So that's two, but timber rattlesnakes and bushmasters, again, two vipers.
Right. I'd have to say, after working on that rattle documentary with you, timber rattlesnakes is up there for me too. They might be my favorite snake. What about, just one last question more about you, one myth about snakes that you'd love to erase forever?
Well, there's so many. I always say to groups of people that like, if somebody saw one garter snake, they saw 100 cottonmouths chasing them. So there's just so many myths, but I guess it's a pretty simple one, but it's a frustrating one, and that would be around the cottonmouths. So this is very specific. We have some more general ones, but just people think cottonmouths live everywhere. Like if they see a snake in the water, it's a cottonmouth, and
right.
Majority of time that's just not the case. Here where I live in Georgia, we literally live the furthest you can be from a cottonmouth in the state, and people still think that they're seeing cottonmouths almost every time they see a snake in the water. And so that's a very specific example, but it is kind of a frustrating one. So I guess I'll go with that one.
Do you think the Snake Talk podcast has made a difference as far as educating the public about these things?
I think so. I think, well, first of all, we've definitely put together an incredible body of knowledge. And I do feel like we've done a pretty good job at getting the information out there, meaning the number of people who have downloaded it. Just being frank, like, I wanted to get it out to more people, and I'm hoping over time that will happen, and we'll continue to promote these episodes. So hopefully it will. But, I think over time we primarily, had a group of followers who would listen to it. And those people were probably mostly interested in snakes, which is great. We wanted that group. I think part of my hope was to also get other people engaged. And I'm sure we've done some of that, but I don't think we did as much of it as I was envisioning or hoping for, but I don't know if that was possible. So,
well, as it stands today, we're up to 200,000 downloads, and still growing. I mean, people are still listening.
It's great.
We'll see where this takes us next. Okay. And for the very last portion of the last Snake Talk episode, I'd love to hear your best snake story.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about this because, obviously I have a lot of snake stories, like anybody who's worked with them their whole life. But I think I'm going to like riff off of like all my experiences with all the other people's snake stories. And so the first thing is that everybody tells me exactly, say, well, I have so many snake stories. That's like a very typical response. And so I'm actually going to tell you two, because I want to cover kind of the two biggest categories. One category of snake stories is, has to do with like venomous snakes and snake bites. So I'm going to tell a short story around that. And then I'm also going to tell a short story kind of more around like discovery and adventure, because it's another big category that people would select. And so to start off, I'm going to tell you probably my closest snake bite encounter. I have multiple stories where it came close.
Oh.
So the first thing I should tell everybody is I've never had a venomous snake bite. And I've had, no exaggeration, over 10,000 venomous snake handling events in my life, but never had a snake bite. The closest, let me back up and just say I did have one strike me in the leg, but I was wearing snake gaiters and they worked. But the closest I ever came to getting a snake bite is back when I was doing my PhD, when I was working on these Great Basin rattlesnakes. And at the time, not many people do this anymore, but we were surgically implanting the transmitters into the snakes, and I was doing it myself. So back in the day, scientists would often do their own surgeries, and this is what I was doing. We also, back in the day, used a lot of ketamine to anesthetize them. And so again, this is a while ago now, but those were the techniques I was using. And I was about to do a surgery on a really large lutosis or Great Basin. And I was doing it at my house on my kitchen table. However, I had just bought a new house, and so I wasn't very familiar with it. It was just, everything was new. And again, people aren't doing this with ketamine anymore, but in the past we used to use ketamine, and we kind of inject, set amount, but we would inject it throughout the body. So I'd injected the snake. I had the snake in a clear tube where its head and kind of front half of its body were in the tube. And I was kind of sitting there holding the snake. And a little bit of time had gone by. And so I ended up like kind of lifting up the snake and the tube to like look at it. Like I lifted it up over my head to look at the snake through the tube. But again, I'm in a new house and I'm not familiar with this place. And I've never had ceiling fans before. And there was a ceiling fan above this kitchen table that was spinning. And I stuck that tube into the ceiling fan, and the ceiling fan instantaneously slung that tube out of my hands. And I was left holding a giant rattlesnake, and the snake was not anesthetized yet. And so the snake just kind of, I remember it was like almost right in front of my face, and the snake like coiled back. I remember seeing it coil back, and I was like, I'm going to get struck in the face. And I just very quickly kind of threw the snake with one hand across the room and avoided that snake bite. But that would be the closest I ever came to getting a snake bite. And then I'll tell a story.
I don't think I'd heard that story.
You
before.
have, or you haven't?
No, I don't think I'd heard that one before.
Okay, good. And the second one is kind of more of a story of exploration. And so like I said, it's this adventure side of me. The first one was, again, the home in me, literally in my kitchen, working with rattlesnakes. And the second one's adventure. And so I already mentioned that Dr. Kaplan also had an interest in big cat conservation, and they do a lot of work with jaguars. And so, and they own, similar to Orianne owning properties, his nonprofit Panthera that does cat work, they own a lot of land down in Brazil. And so we had a big gathering down there, and Tom was down, and a lot of Panthera staff and board members. And so we were down in a region of Brazil, just really wild, remote type of place. And I had never seen an anaconda in the wild. And I was out and looking for, you always hear the stories of you walk through these swamps and you're using your feet to feel for the snakes underwater. And I was doing that. I was out going through these wetlands and with caiman all around me, and feeling my feet for these giant snakes, and couldn't find them. Other people were seeing them. Somebody saw one jogging, for example, and so we were out. I was searching again, but then we spent a lot of time out looking for jaguars, and it was certain. In the dry season, jaguars become very visible in this landscape. So we were seeing like 3, 4, 5 jaguars a day. That was really amazing in and of itself. But we were driving around and ended up, we're zipping around from jaguar to jaguar. The guides all have radios, and when somebody sees a jaguar, they'll kind of radio, and all the boats head that way. And so we're doing that, and we ended up getting called to a jaguar, and so we're racing there on this boat, and this jaguar is just standing there, just really like majestic, like right on the shore of this river, of this giant river. We're only like 30 feet from this animal. We're right there, and he goes down and picks something up off the ground, and he's got a big anaconda in his mouth. So the first anaconda I ever saw was in the mouth of a jaguar, which was pretty amazing. And we got to see others on that trip after that, live ones that we got to handle and all of that. But the point there, I guess, between the two stories is, like so many things in my life, I love that juxtaposition between, home and adventure. And it's the same in snakes.
That's incredible. So tell me, what would happen if you did feel an anaconda with your foot?
Then you go for a ride.
You
grab it and yeah, you'd grab it, and then try to get the head under control, try to get something over the head, try to get control of the snake up near the head.
Wow. All right. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for coming on this podcast and turning the mic around. I'm sure so many people have wanted to hear from you all this time. I know I heard stories that I'd never heard before, and it was wonderful hearing the history of Orianne, your history, and how you've built this incredible organization.
Well, thank you, Tracy. And I wanted to thank the audience for sticking in there with us for 6 years, and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.